Now, this incident is found in the midst of a 3-day event, the essence of which is portrayed in another parable in respect to the fig tree, which Luke describes, saying, "A certain man had a fig tree planted in his vineyard, and he came seeking fruit on it, and did not find any. And he said to the vine dresser, Behold, throughout these 3 years I came seeking fruit on this fig tree, and do not find any. Therefore cut it down. Why even should it use up the ground? And answering, he says to him, Sir, let it alone this year also, until I shall dig around it, and put in manure. And if indeed it should bear fruit in the time, so be it. But if not, you will cut it down." Luke 13, verse 6 to 9. The man in this parable is a reference to the Lord. Having planted Israel in the land of milk and honey, and having given them his laws, he is now seeking fruit from it. The 3 years mentioned in this parable we can associate with that of the ministry of the Lord, the fourth being in respect to the sacrifice of offering of his body, through which everything associated with the fig tree was brought to a close. In the law, the Passover lamb is kept with the household from the 10th of the month of Nisan until the 14th, when it's killed. Here it is important to bear in mind the cutting down of the fig tree is not some negative thing, but a necessary aspect in order to bring forth a new form of life that is apart from the association to the fig tree of the Garden of Eden, that is the flesh. And in order for us to lay bare the intended purpose of God, we need to build a clear narrative of the incident by pulling from all the 4 Gospels. In doing so, we have to view each Gospel writer from the perspective they are writing from. Pastor Joseph Prince teaches that Matthew, which is represented by a lion, is written from the perspective of the King of the Jews. So the genealogy of the Lord is traced as the son of David, the son of Abraham, which is specific to the children of Israel. Mark, who is represented by an ox, is written from the perspective of a servant in relation to the high priest, with no genealogy, because the service of priesthood which the Lord provides is not according to the flesh descent, but according to Melchizedek. As Paul says, "For it is evident that our Lord has sprung out of Judah, a tribe as to which Moses spoke nothing concerning priests. And it is yet more abundantly evident if another priest according to the likeness of Melchizedek arises, who has been constituted not according to a law of fleshly commandments, but according to the power of an indestructible life." Hebrews 7, verses 14 to 15. That is to say, the priesthood in service to God is of the Spirit and not that of the flesh. Luke is represented as a man which is from the perspective of all of mankind, that is the Gentiles. So the genealogy of the Lord in this gospel is traced all the way back to Adam. Finally, we have John represented by an eagle, which is in respect to God. As such, there is no genealogy of beginning or end. Therefore, in the Gospel of John, the Lord is not described as being taken up from the earth, but is left in the midst of us as an everlasting presence, whom we are to follow, illustrated by Peter and John in the Gospel of John, chapter 21, verses 9 to 22. Here, it is worth considering why, from all the disciples of the Lord, only Peter and John were described as following the Lord. Now, many times the issue of Peter's name as a stone has been a cause for great division within the church. Some, erroneously interpreting Matthew 16, verse 18, have attributed Peter to be the foundation the church is built on. However, Paul clearly states, "For no one is able to lay another foundation besides the one being already laid, which is Jesus Christ," 1 Corinthians 3:11, as well as Isaiah 28, verse 16. As such, Peter's name as stone has more to do with the law of Moses as a tablet of stone that is given to the children of Israel than the church. It is the very reason Peter is known as the apostle to the Jews. As Paul says, "I have been entrusted with the gospel to the uncircumcision, that is Gentiles, just as Peter of the circumcision, that is Jews." Galatians 2, verse 8. Now, in the same respect, we have John following the Lord, whose name means God is gracious. So what this passage is illustrating to us is the 2 covenants, one of the law, that is Peter, and the other is grace, that is John. As such, Peter, as a representative of the law, is commanded to follow the Lord to his death. However, John, as a representative of grace, his end is left ambiguous. The Lord said, "If I desire him to remain until I come, what is that to you? You follow me." John 21, verse 22. The purpose of which was to demonstrate the present period of grace which we are under will come to an end when the Lord returns to receive his bride at the rapture. And Christian tradition states that Peter died sometime between 64 and 68 AD, just shy of 70 AD, when Jerusalem and the temple worship was brought to a predetermined end, while John outlived all the other disciples. This point is also illustrated in another teaching of Joseph Prince in respect to Peter, James, and John at the Mount of Transfiguration, titled "Hear Jesus Only and Be Uplifted." The link to this teaching is provided in the description below. Now we find the beginning of the incident described in the main text of our study to be on Palm Sunday, when the Lord was coming into Jerusalem riding on the colt of a donkey. And John states that people gathered to receive him with palm branches in their hands, crying out, "Hosanna, blessed is he, the one coming in the name of the Lord, and the King of Israel." John 12, verse 13. At this point, Luke states the indignation of the priests, saying, "And some of the Pharisees from the crowd said to him, 'Teacher, rebuke your disciples.' And answering, he said, 'I say to you that if this will be silent, the stones will cry out.'" Luke 39-40. Now, as he was approaching Jerusalem, only Luke records the statement of the Lord when he wept, describing the destruction that was about to come upon Jerusalem, because she did not know the season of her visitation. And as profound as this statement of the Lord was, it is very curious that only Luke makes mention of it, the purpose of which was to illustrate how the coming event was hidden from the sight of the Jews. So neither Matthew nor Mark recorded this event. At this point, Mark makes a note of the end of the first day, saying, "And he entered into Jerusalem, into the temple, and having looked around on all things, the hour being already late, he went out of Bethany with the 12. Mark 11:11. The second day begins in the morning, when the Lord was on the way to the temple, and Mark records the first time the Lord interacted with the fig tree, seeking fruit from it, but finding none, he cursed it. And Mark distinguishes this moment, saying, "And his disciples were listening." Mark 11:14. Meaning, even though the disciples of the Lord heard him curse the fig tree, they did not see any change in the tree that very moment or day. This was followed by the event in the temple, which is recorded by Matthew, Mark, and Luke as, "And having entered into the temple, he began to cast out those selling, saying to them, 'It has been written, my house will be a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers.'" Luke 19, verses 45-46. Here there are layers of information that is revealed according to the purpose of each writer. So Luke, as a Gentile, no specific details in regards to doves as an offering for sins was necessary to be mentioned. But Matthew and Mark add, he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those selling the doves. Matthew 21:12. So Matthew, from the perspective of the Jews, this detail has significance, because during Passover, Jews from all around the world come to worship in Jerusalem. So changing money to a local currency in order to buy what is required for the offering of sins, like the doves, is convenient if the transaction is conducted within the courts of the temple. But Mark makes this observation from the perspective of the servants in terms of the priesthood. That is, the casting out of business from the temple courts aggravated the scribes and Pharisees far more than those that conducted the business, saying, "And the chief priests and the scribes heard it, and they were seeking how they might destroy him." Mark 11:18. Because business conducted within the premise of the temple courts benefits the scribes and Pharisees, who most likely charged for the privilege. Finally, Mark adds one more detail, saying, "And he would not permit that anyone should carry a vessel through the temple." Mark 11:16. Mark is making this statement from the perspective of a servant on duty going about their daily business, using the temple as a shortcut. So we see the Lord clearing out the temple of all common use. the Jews in respect to the convenience of those that buy, the ministers of the house in terms of financial gain in respect to those that sell, down to the lowly servant going about their daily duties. And the Lord makes a statement saying, my house will be called a house of prayer for all nations. Mark 11:17. Now, Matthew in respect to Jews and Luke in respect to Gentiles do not specify all nations, but only Mark, which is a reference to the service rendered to God, is not according to flesh, be it Jew or Gentile, but that of the Spirit. As John says, God is Spirit, and it behooves those worshipping him to worship in spirit and truth. John 4:24. That is to say, all nations are only able to approach God by one Spirit. Ephesians 2:18. To this, Mark adds how on the same day he healed people in the temple, and unlike the previous day when he came into the city riding on a donkey and the disciples were singing, this time the children were singing the same as the previous day, saying, Hosanna to the Son of David. And the priests were once more being indignant, said to him, do you hear what they say? And Jesus says to them, yes, have you never read, out of the mouth of babes and sucklings you have prepared for yourself praise? Matthew 21:15-16. At this point, both Matthew and Mark record the end of the second day, saying he went out of the city to Bethany, and he passed the night there. Matthew 21:17. The third day begins once more as they are going to the temple. And Mark states, and passing by in the morning, they saw the fig tree having dried up from the roots. And Peter, having remembered, says to him, Rabbi, look, the fig tree that you cursed is dried up. Mark 11:20-21. Now, unlike Mark, who distinctly separated the moment the Lord spoke to the moment they saw the fig tree dried up from its roots, Matthew simply states the statement of the Lord on the day they saw the tree having dried from the root, saying, and the fig tree withered immediately. However, he gives a slight hint to the time having passed from the reaction of the disciples, saying, and having seen it, the disciples marveled, saying, how did the fig tree wither so quickly? Matthew 21:19-20. So Matthew does not specify the moment they heard the Lord speak, but recounts the entire event on the day they saw the outcome, meaning from the perspective of the Jews, there are many things the Lord had said to them, and even though they heard, they did not recall it to mind until they saw it come to pass, to which we can attribute his crucifixion, his resurrection, and even his commandment to preach to all the world. This being said, the Lord used this as an opportunity to teach them on faith, that is, speaking, believing that things we say will come to pass, and do not doubt, we will see the results. Mark 11:22-24. So when the Lord spoke that word, the fig tree already withered away, even though it was not apparent to the eyes until the next morning.